The morning of resilience. The dawn had barely stretched its fingers across the rooftops when Amara woke. Her small frame slid out from under the threadbare blanket she shared with her younger brother, Malik, whose soft snores filled the cramped room. Their one-room shack was quiet except for the occasional cough from their mother, Lila. The sound sent a pang through Amara's chest, a sharp reminder of why today mattered so much. She couldn't afford to fail. Amara dressed quickly in a faded blue dress that hung a little too short and clung tightly around the shoulders. It had once been her mother's, and though it had seen better days, it was her only option. She slipped on her sandals, cracked at the edges, and worn thin but still functional. Every part of her appearance told a story of perseverance and scarcity, but Amara paid it no mind. Today wasn't about appearances, it was about survival. "Be careful today, Amara," her mother murmured weakly from the corner of the room, her voice hoarse and cracking. She lay curled on a makeshift bed of old cushions, a damp cloth pressed to her forehead. "I will, Mama," Amara replied, her tone resolute. She tried to swallow the lump rising in her throat as she glanced at her mother's pale face. "I'll sell enough flowers. Don't worry." Her mother offered a faint smile, but the sadness in her eyes betrayed her. She didn't have the strength to protest or reassure her daughter. She simply nodded, watching as Amara picked up the woven basket filled with freshly plucked flowers from their neighbor's small garden. The blooms weren't perfect. Some petals drooped slightly, and a few stems were uneven, but they were all Amara had. The streets were already coming to life as Amara made her way to the corner she had claimed as her spot. The neighborhood was a mix of bustling activity and quiet despair. Vendors were setting up their carts, children were running barefoot through the dusty alleyways, and buses roared down the main road, kicking up clouds of grit and exhaust. Amara reached her corner and set her basket down. She arranged the flowers, placing the brightest and freshest at the top. Her fingers worked with practiced efficiency, though her heart felt heavy. She looked up and took a deep breath. People were already passing by. Men in suits clutching briefcases, women in tailored dresses rushing to offices, and vendors shouting about their wares. To these people, she was invisible, a speck of dust in the chaos of their lives. She straightened her posture and picked up a rose, its red petals soft and velvety. "Flowers, ma'am. Fresh flowers, only 5 rands." She called out to a woman in a navy blue coat. The woman glanced her way, her face flickering with brief interest, before her expression hardened into indifference. She shook her head and walked on. Amara sighed but refused to let her disappointment show. This was how it always began, rejections piling up like fallen leaves, one after the other. But she couldn't stop. The money she earned from selling flowers wasn't just for food. It was for her mother's medicine. Medicine that cost more than they could afford on most days. "Flowers, sir. For someone special." Amara tried again as a man in a sharp gray suit walked past. He didn't even look at her. The hours dragged on, and Amara felt the sun climbing higher in the sky. Her stomach growled, but she ignored it. She had learned long ago to push hunger aside, to focus on the task at hand. A few coins jingled in her small pouch, barely enough to buy a loaf of bread, let alone the medication her mother needed. Amara saw a group of office workers laughing near a food cart. The smell of grilled meat and spices wafted toward her, making her stomach twist. She hesitated, then gathered her courage and approached them. "Excuse me, sir," she said to a man with a loosened tie and a carefree demeanor. "Would you like to buy a flower?" He glanced at her briefly, his smile fading. "No, thanks," he said curtly, turning back to his conversation. Another woman, sipping coffee, offered a sympathetic smile. "Not today, sweetheart," she said before continuing her chatter with her colleagues. Amara's chest tightened, but she forced herself to smile. "Thank you," she murmured, retreating to her corner. She rearranged the flowers, trying to make them look more appealing, though her hands trembled slightly. Her sandals scuffed against the pavement as she returned to her spot. Her hope was waning, but she knew she couldn't stop. Then she saw him. A tall man in a sleek black suit walked briskly down the street, his polished shoes clicking against the pavement. His hair was neatly combed, and a gold watch glinted on his wrist. Everything about him screamed wealth and success. He carried himself with the air of someone who owned the world, someone who wouldn't stop for a girl selling flowers. Amara's heart raced. She didn't know why, but something about him made her take a step forward. She clutched a flower in her hand and called out, "Sir, flowers? Just 5 rands." The man's gaze flicked to her briefly. His expression was cold, disinterested. He didn't break stride, didn't say a word. He simply walked past, leaving her standing there with her hand outstretched. Amara felt a lump rise in her throat, but she swallowed it down. She wouldn't let one rejection, or 100, break her. She adjusted her basket and stood tall, watching as the man disappeared into the crowd. Her mother's face, pale and weary, flashed in her mind. She couldn't afford to lose hope. The day wore on, and the streets grew busier. Amara continued calling out, her voice growing hoarse. She sold a few flowers, enough to scrape together a little money. But it wasn't enough. The weight of what she needed pressed heavily on her chest. As she rearranged her basket for the 100th time, she noticed the same man again. He had stopped further down the street, his phone pressed to his ear. He looked engrossed, his free hand gesturing as he spoke. Amara hesitated, then took a deep breath and approached him. "Sir," she said, her voice steady despite the nerves fluttering in her chest. "Please, just 1 flower." The man turned, his eyes narrowing slightly as he recognized her. For a moment, he said nothing, his gaze flicking between her face and the rose in her hand. Then, to her surprise, he asked, "Why are you doing this?" Amara's throat tightened, but she held his gaze. "My mother is sick," she said simply. "I'm selling flowers to buy her medicine." Something shifted in the man's expression. It wasn't pity, exactly, but a flicker of understanding. He reached into his wallet and pulled out a crisp 50-rand note. "Here," he said, handing it to her. "Keep the change." Amara's eyes widened as she stared at the bill. Her first instinct was gratitude, but then she shook her head. "No, sir," she said firmly. "Just buy a flower. I don't want charity." The man's brows furrowed in surprise, but he nodded slowly. He took the rose from her hand and tucked it into his jacket pocket. "All right," he said, his voice softer now. "Thank you." As he walked away, Amara stood still for a moment, her heart pounding. She didn't know why, but something about the interaction left her feeling a strange mix of relief and uncertainty. She had made a little progress, but the day was far from over. She returned to her corner, adjusting the flowers in her basket once more. There was no time to rest. Her mother was waiting, the unexpected advocate. The afternoon sun was relentless as Amara wiped sweat from her brow, her energy waning. She stood at her usual corner, gripping the basket of flowers as though it were her anchor in a storm. The handful of coins in her pocket jingled softly, mocking her efforts. The thought of returning home without enough money for her mother's medicine felt like a heavy chain around her neck. She caught sight of the man in the black suit. Rodrigo, she'd later learn his name. Once again, standing near a coffee stand across the street. He was engrossed in a conversation on his phone, his sharp features tense and commanding. Amara hesitated, debating whether she should approach him again. Part of her was afraid of pushing her luck, but her mother's pale face surfaced in her mind, spurring her forward. As she crossed the street, weaving through the crowd, her heart raced. The city's cacophony seemed to blur into a dull roar, leaving only the sound of her own footsteps echoing in her ears. She reached Rodrigo just as he ended his call. "Sir," she began, her voice shaking slightly but steadying as she continued. "Thank you for buying the flower earlier, but I still need to sell more." Rodrigo turned to her, eyebrows raised. For a moment, he seemed taken aback by her persistence. His sharp eyes scanned her face, taking in the weariness etched into her young features, the determination burning in her dark eyes. "You're back," he said, more a statement than a question. "Yes, sir," Amara replied, clutching the basket tightly. "I have no choice. My mother, she needs more than just medicine. She's sicker than I realized." Her voice broke slightly, but she quickly regained her composure. "I'm not asking for charity. I just need to sell these flowers." Rodrigo stared at her, his expression unreadable. "Why not accept help when it's offered?" he asked, his tone even but tinged with curiosity. "Sometimes it's not about charity. It's about surviving." Amara shook her head, her grip on the basket tightening. "Because surviving isn't enough, sir. I need to stand on my own. I need to show my brothers that even when things are hard, we can hold our heads high." Her voice grew firmer with each word. "My mother taught me that." Rodrigo was silent for a moment, his gaze unwavering. Finally, he sighed and ran a hand through his neatly combed hair. "All right," he said, his voice softer now. "Let's see if we can sell these flowers." Amara blinked, surprised. "What do you mean, sir?" "I mean, let's find some buyers," Rodrigo said, adjusting his tie. "You've got determination, but you're going about this the hard way." Before Amara could protest, Rodrigo gestured for her to follow him. He walked with purpose, his long strides cutting through the crowd effortlessly. Amara hurried to keep up, her sandals slapping against the pavement. They stopped at a bustling street corner where vendors lined the sidewalks, their stalls overflowing with everything from fresh produce to handcrafted jewelry. Rodrigo surveyed the scene, his sharp eyes scanning the crowd. He turned to Amara. "Stand here," he instructed, motioning to a spot near a busy cafe. "This is where people stop to chat, linger. You'll have better luck here." Amara hesitated, glancing at her usual corner across the street. "But I've always sold from over there," she said softly. "And how's that working out for you?" Rodrigo asked, his tone light but pointed. Amara bit her lip, realizing he was right. She set down her basket and began arranging the flowers again, her fingers trembling slightly. Rodrigo stood nearby, his presence commanding enough to draw curious glances from passers-by. "Now," he said, crossing his arms. "Try again." Amara took a deep breath and lifted a bouquet of daisies. "Flowers, ma'am. Fresh daisies for your home," she called out. Her voice was stronger this time, fueled by a mixture of determination and the strange sense of reassurance she felt with Rodrigo nearby. A woman in a floral dress stopped, her eyes darting between Amara and Rodrigo. "How much?" she asked. "5 rands, ma'am," Amara replied, holding out the bouquet. The woman smiled and handed her a crisp bill before taking the flowers. Amara's heart soared. She turned to Rodrigo, a small smile tugging at her lips. He nodded, his expression still serious but slightly softer. "See," he said. "Right spot, right pitch." They continued this way for the next hour, Rodrigo occasionally stepping in to encourage hesitant buyers. His polished demeanor and calm authority seemed to draw people in, making them more willing to stop and listen. Amara marveled at how easily he commanded attention, his mere presence giving her efforts an unexpected boost. By the time the sun began to dip low in the sky, Amara's basket was almost empty. Her shoulders ached, and her feet throbbed, but she felt lighter than she had in weeks. She counted the money in her pouch, her eyes widening as she realized she had earned enough for her mother's medicine. And even a little extra. "Thank you, sir," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "I don't know how to repay you." Rodrigo waved her off. "You did the work," he said simply. "I just pointed you in the right direction." Amara hesitated, then asked, "Why did you help me?" Rodrigo's gaze softened, and for the first time, a small smile curved his lips. "Because I've seen too many people give up before they even try," he said. "You didn't. That's rare." Amara nodded, her chest swelling with a mix of gratitude and pride. She had faced countless rejections that day, but she had also found an unexpected ally. As Rodrigo turned to leave, she called out, "Thank you again, sir." He paused, glancing back at her. "Call me Rodrigo," he said with a faint smile before disappearing into the crowd. Amara stood there for a moment, clutching her basket. For the first time in a long time, she felt a glimmer of hope, not just for her mother's recovery, but for their future. That night, when Amara returned home, she handed her mother the medicine with a triumphant smile. Layla's tired eyes filled with tears as she pulled her daughter into a weak but heartfelt embrace. "You did it," Layla whispered, her voice breaking. "You're incredible, Amara." Amara held her mother tightly, her own tears spilling over. "I'll keep doing it, Mama. I'll keep fighting for us." As she lay down that night, her body aching, but her spirit unyielding, Amara thought of Rodrigo and his unexpected kindness. She didn't know if she'd ever see him again, but she knew one thing for certain. She wasn't alone in this fight. The bonds that build resilience. The next morning, Amara woke before the first rays of sunlight crept through the tiny window of their home. Her body ached, and her feet were sore from the previous day. But she didn't let the discomfort slow her down. There was work to do, more flowers to sell, more money to earn, and an uncertain future to face with courage. She slipped out of the house quietly, careful not to wake her mother or brothers. Before leaving, she glanced back at her mother, whose fragile form seemed even smaller under the thin blanket. The sight gave her a sharp pang of urgency, propelling her forward. The streets were quieter than usual, the city still shaking off its slumber. Amara's sandals slapped against the uneven pavement as she made her way to the florist who supplied her with the flowers she sold. Mrs. Pinta, an elderly widow who ran a small garden business, greeted her with a warm smile. "Amara, dear, you're here early," Mrs. Pinta said, her wrinkled hands busy trimming the stems of freshly picked roses. "Yes, Mom. I need to get a head start," Amara replied, setting her basket on the table. Her voice was steady, but there was an urgency she couldn't hide. Mrs. Pinta paused her work, her sharp eyes studying Amara's face. "Child, you look exhausted. You've been pushing yourself too hard." Amara forced a smile. "I have to. My mother needs me." The older woman's expression softened. She placed a hand on Amara's shoulder, her touch gentle but firm. "You're a strong girl, but even the strongest need rest. Don't forget that." Amara nodded, though she didn't fully believe her. Rest was a luxury she couldn't afford. Mrs. Pinta handed her a fresh batch of flowers, roses, daisies, and lilies, and wished her luck as she left. Amara returned to her new spot near the busy cafe, the place Rodrigo had suggested. The morning crowd was already beginning to gather, people rushing to their jobs or lingering over steaming cups of coffee. She arranged her flowers, her fingers working quickly to make the bouquet as appealing as possible. "Fresh flowers. Brighten your day or someone else's," she called out, her voice clear and inviting. A few people stopped, and she sold her first bouquet within minutes, her spirits lifted slightly. Rodrigo's advice had worked wonders the day before, and she felt more confident now. As she continued calling out to passersby, her mind wandered to Rodrigo. Would he pass by again? Would he stop to help her like he had yesterday? The thought brought a mix of hope and unease. She didn't want to rely on him, but his support had made her feel less alone. By midday, the sun was high, and Amara's pouch jingled with coins. She had sold more flowers than usual, but she still needed to sell the rest. She was rearranging the bouquet when a familiar voice startled her. "You're making a habit of this." Amara looked up to see Rodrigo standing a few feet away, his hands in his pockets and a faint smile tugging at the corners of his lips. He was dressed as sharply as ever, but his demeanor was less formal today. "Rodrigo," she said, surprised. She quickly straightened up, brushing her hands on her dress. "I wasn't expecting to see you again." He shrugged. "I was curious to see how you were doing." His eyes flicked to her basket. "Looks like you're managing." Amara smiled faintly. "Thanks to your advice." Rodrigo gestured toward the cafe. "Do you have a moment? I want to talk." Amara hesitated. She wasn't used to taking breaks, but Rodrigo's tone was serious. "Okay," she said, picking up her basket and following him to a nearby table. As they sat down, Rodrigo leaned forward, his expression thoughtful. "Why don't you let someone help you?" he asked, his voice calm but probing. "There are organizations, charities, people who could make this easier for you." Amara looked down at her hands, her fingers tracing the handle of her basket. "I've thought about it," she admitted. "But I've seen what happens when people rely on charity. It doesn't last, and it changes the way people look at you." Rodrigo frowned. "How so?" "They see you as weak," Amara said, her voice firm. "As someone who can't stand on their own. I don't want that. I want to show my brothers that we can get through this by working hard. That we can still have pride, even when things are tough." Rodrigo was silent for a moment, his gaze steady. "That's admirable," he said finally. "But pride won't pay for your mother's treatment." Amara's chest tightened. "I know that," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "But this is all I have. Selling these flowers, it's my way of fighting for her." Rodrigo leaned back, his expression unreadable. "You remind me of someone," he said quietly. "Who?" Amara asked, curious. "My mother," Rodrigo replied. His voice had a hint of sadness she hadn't heard before. "She raised me and my sister on her own. Worked 2 jobs, barely slept. She never asked for help, even when she needed it. I admired her for that, but I also hated seeing her struggle." Amara stared at him, surprised by his candor. "What did you do?" she asked. Rodrigo smiled faintly. "I worked harder, studied harder, made sure I could take care of her when I was older." His smile faded. "But sometimes I wonder if I should have done more for her sooner." The weight of his words settled between them, heavy and unspoken. Amara didn't know what to say, so she simply nodded. Rodrigo cleared his throat and leaned forward again. "I want to help you, Amara. Not out of pity, but because I see something in you, something rare." Amara hesitated, her heart pounding. She wanted to trust him, but the thought of accepting help still made her uneasy. "How?" "Let me invest in your flowers," Rodrigo said. "We'll call it a business partnership. I'll provide more flowers, better ones, and you'll sell them. We'll split the profits." Amara blinked, stunned. "You'd do that?" "Yes," Rodrigo said, "but only if you agree to let me teach you how to grow this into something bigger. You have the drive, but you need a plan." Amara's mind raced. The idea was tempting, but it also felt overwhelming. Could she handle it? Could she trust him? "I need to think about it," she said finally, her voice steady. Rodrigo nodded. "Take your time, but don't take too long. Opportunities don't wait forever." As Amara returned to her corner, her mind was a whirlwind of thoughts. Rodrigo's offer was generous, but it also came with risks. Could she really turn her small flower business into something bigger? And what would it mean for her family? That evening, as she counted her earnings at home, her mother watched her with a mixture of pride and concern. "You've done well today," Leela said softly. "But don't wear yourself out, my child." Amara looked at her mother, her heart aching. "Mama, what if there's a way to do more? To make things better?" Leela frowned slightly. "What do you mean?" Amara hesitated, then told her about Rodrigo's offer. Her mother listened carefully, her eyes narrowing thoughtfully. "He seems like a good man," she said finally. "But be careful, Amara. Not everyone has pure intentions." "I know," Amara said, "but I think he's different. He understands what it's like to struggle." Leela nodded slowly. "Then follow your heart, my child. But remember, no matter what happens, you've already made me proud." Amara smiled, tears welling in her eyes. "I'll make the right choice, Mama. I promise." As she lay down that night, her thoughts kept drifting back to Rodrigo's words. For the first time, the future didn't seem so daunting. It seemed full of possibilities. The first steps toward change. The dawn came quickly, painting the sky in shades of orange and gold as Amara made her way through the still quiet streets of the city. Her basket felt lighter today, even though it was full of freshly arranged flowers. The conversation with Rodrigo the previous day had stayed with her, lingering in her mind like an unanswered question. Could she trust him? Could she really take a chance on his offer? As she reached her usual spot near the cafe, she saw the familiar sight of morning commuters bustling by, their faces preoccupied and distant. This time, however, she felt a spark of hope. The prospect of turning her small venture into something bigger ignited a fire in her, one she hadn't felt in years. She adjusted the flowers in her basket, arranging them carefully so that their vibrant colors caught the eye. Fresh flowers, brighten your day or someone else's, she called out, her voice steady and clear. Within minutes, a young woman stopped to buy a bouquet of daisies. Then an older man purchased a single rose for his wife. The coins jingled softly in Amara's pouch, a melody of progress. Yet, even as she worked, her mind was filled with uncertainty. Rodrigo's words had opened a door to possibilities she hadn't considered before, but stepping through that door felt like a leap into the unknown. By midday, the sun was high in the sky, and Amara had sold more flowers than she'd expected. As she paused to take a sip of water from the small bottle she carried, a familiar figure emerged from the crowd. Rodrigo, dressed in another sharp suit, approached with the same confident stride that always seemed to draw attention. "Busy morning?" he asked, his tone casual but his eyes sharp. Amara nodded, smiling faintly. "Yes, sir. It's been a good day so far." Rodrigo raised an eyebrow. "Still calling me sir? I thought we agreed on Rodrigo." Amara's cheeks flushed. "Sorry, Rodrigo," she said, feeling slightly self-conscious. He gestured to a nearby bench. "Do you have a moment?" Amara hesitated, glancing at her basket. She didn't want to lose potential sales, but the seriousness in his tone made her curious. She nodded, picking up her basket and following him to the bench. Once they were seated, Rodrigo leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. "I wanted to check in," he began. "Have you thought about what I said yesterday?" Amara took a deep breath, her fingers tightening around the basket handle. "I have," she said, "and I'm grateful for your offer, but I'm afraid. What if it doesn't work? What if I fail?" Rodrigo's gaze softened. "Amara, failure isn't the enemy. Doing nothing because you're afraid, that's the real failure." He leaned back, his expression thoughtful. "You've already proven that you're capable of more than most people your age. You're out here every day, fighting for your family. That takes courage." Amara looked down at her hands, her chest tightening. "But this is different. I've never done anything like running a business." Rodrigo smiled faintly. "That's why I'm offering to help. I'm not just throwing money at you. I want to teach you, show you how to make this work." Amara hesitated, the weight of his words settling over her. She wanted to trust him, but a lifetime of hardship had taught her to be wary of promises that seemed too good to be true. "Why are you doing this?" she asked finally, her voice quiet. "You don't even know me." Rodrigo's expression grew serious. "Because someone once helped me when I needed it most," he said. "And because I see something in you. You're determined, resourceful, and unafraid to work hard. That's rare, Amara. And I believe in investing in people who have potential." Amara felt a lump rise in her throat. She had spent so much of her life feeling invisible, overlooked. Hearing someone say they believed in her was both comforting and overwhelming. "What would I have to do?" she asked, her voice steady despite the storm of emotions swirling inside her. Rodrigo's smile returned, this time warmer. "First, we'll find a supplier who can provide better flowers at a lower cost. That will increase your profit margin. Then we'll work on presentation, better baskets, more appealing arrangements. And eventually we'll look at expanding. Maybe hire a few others to sell flowers in different parts of the city." Amara blinked, the scope of his vision startling her. "That sounds Big, she said, struggling to find the right words. It is, Rodrigo admitted, but you don't have to do it all at once. We'll take it step by step. The first step is saying yes. Amara stared at him, her heart pounding. The opportunity he was offering was more than she had ever dared to dream of. But it was also terrifying. What if she couldn't keep up? What if she let him down? After a long moment, she took a deep breath and nodded. Okay, she said. I'll do it. Rodrigo's smile widened. Good. We'll start tomorrow. The rest of the day passed in a blur. Amara sold the last of her flowers by late afternoon, her pouch heavier than it had ever been. As she walked home, she replayed her conversation with Rodrigo in her mind, the mix of excitement and fear making her pulse quicken. When she arrived home, her brothers ran to greet her, their small faces lighting up with smiles. Amara, did you sell everything? Malik asked, his voice full of hope. Yes, Amara replied, ruffling his hair. And I have good news. She gathered her family in the small, dimly lit room and told them about Rodrigo's offer. Her brothers listened with wide eyes, and her mother's expression shifted from worry to cautious optimism. Are you sure about this, Amara? Leela asked, her voice soft but serious. It sounds like a lot. It is, Amara admitted, but it's also a chance to do more, to make things better for all of us. Her mother reached out, taking her hand. I trust you, my child. Whatever you decide, we'll support you. Amara nodded, her resolve strengthening. For the first time in a long time, she felt like the weight she carried wasn't hers alone. The next morning, Amara met Rodrigo at a small coffee shop in the city center. He had already arranged a meeting with a supplier, and as they sat down to discuss prices and options, Amara realized just how much she had to learn. Rodrigo guided her through the process, patiently explaining terms and strategies she had never encountered before. By the end of the meeting, they had secured a deal for higher quality flowers at a better price. Amara's head spun with new information, but she felt a spark of excitement. This wasn't just about survival anymore. It was about building something. As they walked out of the shop, Rodrigo turned to her. You did well today, he said. This is just the beginning, but you're off to a strong start. Amara smiled, her confidence growing. Thank you, Rodrigo, for everything. He nodded, his expression serious but kind. Don't thank me yet. The real work starts now. Amara nodded, her heart pounding with a mix of anticipation and determination. She knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy, but for the first time, she felt like she wasn't walking it alone. Dreams in bloom. The days that followed were a whirlwind for Amara. Her simple routine of standing on a street corner with a basket of flowers transformed into something she barely recognized. Rodrigo had insisted on meeting her every morning, and their conversations quickly shifted from flowers to strategies, budgets, and long-term goals. It was overwhelming at first, but Amara was determined to keep up. She couldn't afford to waste this opportunity. One morning, Rodrigo took her to a bustling wholesale market on the outskirts of the city. The air was thick with the scent of fresh blooms, the stalls overflowing with every type of flower imaginable. Vendors called out prices, their voices blending with the sounds of carts rolling and customers haggling. It was a world Amara had never seen before. This is where the real business happens, Rodrigo said, his voice rising above the din. He led her to a stall owned by a man named Mr. Patel, a supplier he had worked with in the past. Mr. Patel was a tall, broad man with a warm smile and a sharp eye for business. So this is the young lady you've been telling me about, Mr. Patel said, shaking Amara's hand firmly. Rodrigo speaks highly of you. Amara flushed slightly, glancing at Rodrigo. Thank you, sir, she said, her voice steady despite the nervous flutter in her chest. They spent the next hour discussing prices, quality, and delivery schedules. Rodrigo guided the conversation, but he made sure to involve Amara in every decision. By the end of the meeting, they had secured a deal for a weekly supply of fresh flowers at a fraction of what Amara had been paying before. As they walked back to Rodrigo's car, Amara couldn't contain her excitement. "That was incredible," she said, her eyes shining. "I never thought I could buy flowers like that." Rodrigo smiled. "You're not just buying flowers anymore, Amara. You're running a business. And this is just the beginning." The next step was presentation. Rodrigo had a contact at a small craft shop who agreed to provide elegant baskets and wrapping materials at a discount. Amara spent hours learning how to arrange the flowers in ways that made them look more appealing. Rodrigo even helped her design a simple sign to place near her stand, advertising her business as Amara's Blooms. At first, Amara felt awkward using the new baskets and wrapping paper. She worried that her regular customers might think she was charging too much or that she was trying to be something she wasn't. But to her surprise, the changes had the opposite effect. People stopped more often, drawn in by the bright professional arrangements. She sold out faster than ever before, and her earnings doubled in just a few days. One afternoon, as she packed up her stand, a young woman approached her, holding one of the bouquets Amara had sold earlier in the day. "Are you Amara?" the woman asked, her voice warm. "Yes," Amara replied, puzzled. "My name is Grace," the woman said. "I work for the local community center. We're hosting a charity gala next weekend, and I'd like to place an order for centerpieces. Your flowers are beautiful." Amara's heart leaped. "A gala," she repeated, hardly believing her ears. "You want me to provide the flowers?" Grace nodded, smiling. "Yes, I've been looking for something unique, and your arrangements are perfect. Would you be able to do it?" Amara hesitated, glancing at her basket. She had never handled an order this large before. "I'll need to check with my supplier," she said finally. "But I'd love to try." Grace handed her a business card. "Great. Let me know by tomorrow. We'll need about 30 arrangements." Amara stared at the card, her mind racing. 30 arrangements. It was a daunting task, but the opportunity was too good to pass up. That evening, she met Rodrigo at the cafe to discuss the order. "A gala," Rodrigo said, his eyebrows raising. "That's impressive. Are you ready for it?" "I think so," Amara said, though her voice wavered slightly. "But it's a lot. I'll need more flowers, more baskets, more wrapping paper." Rodrigo nodded thoughtfully. "It's a challenge, but it's doable. You'll need to plan carefully, and you might need some help." Amara frowned. "Help?" "Yes," Rodrigo said. "You can't do everything alone, especially as your business grows. It's time to think about bringing others on board." The idea made Amara uneasy. She had always worked alone, relying on her own efforts to make ends meet. But Rodrigo was right. This order was too big for her to handle alone. "I'll think about it," she said finally. The next day, Amara returned to the community center to confirm the order. Grace was thrilled and handed Amara an advance payment to cover the supplies. With the money in hand, Amara went straight to the market to place a bulk order with Mr. Patel. "You're moving up in the world," Mr. Patel said with a grin as he handed her the invoice. "Keep this up, and you'll be running a flower empire in no time." Amara laughed nervously. "One step at a time," she said. She spent the next few days preparing for the gala, working from dawn until well into the night. Her brothers helped where they could, cutting ribbons and arranging flowers under her careful instruction. Even her mother, despite her frail condition, offered advice on color combinations and presentation. On the day of the gala, Rodrigo arrived with a rented van to help transport the arrangements. Amara watched as the flowers were loaded carefully into the vehicle, her heart pounding with a mix of pride and nerves. "You've done an incredible job," Rodrigo said as they drove to the venue. "This is a big step for you." Amara nodded, her hands clenched in her lap. "I just hope they like it." The gala was held in a grand hall adorned with twinkling lights and elegant decorations. Amara's flowers were placed on each table, their vibrant colors adding a touch of warmth to the sophisticated setting. As guests began to arrive, Amara stood off to the side, watching nervously. One by one, people approached her to compliment the arrangements. Grace introduced her to several attendees, including potential clients who expressed interest in her services. By the end of the night, Amara had not only fulfilled her first major order, but also secured several new opportunities. As she left the venue with Rodrigo, the weight of her accomplishments hit her all at once. She had taken a leap of faith and succeeded in ways she never thought possible. "You're building something amazing, Amara," Rodrigo said as they drove back to her neighborhood. "This is just the beginning." Amara smiled, her heart swelling with gratitude and determination. For the first time, she could see a future beyond mere survival, a future filled with growth, possibilities, and the chance to make a real difference for her family. A blossoming future. The morning after the gala, Amara woke to the sound of Malik laughing in the kitchen. It was a rare sound in their small home, and it filled her with a sense of hope she hadn't felt in years. She sat up, stretching her aching arms. The long days leading up to the gala had been grueling, but the outcome was more than worth it. The advance payment, tips from guests, and new client leads had given her a sense of momentum she could scarcely believe. As she stepped into the main room, her mother was sitting at the small table, sipping tea. Though Lila still looked frail, there was a light in her eyes that hadn't been there for a long time. "You did something incredible yesterday, Amara," her mother said, her voice warm but soft. "I'm proud of you." Amara smiled, walking over to hug her mother. "I couldn't have done it without everyone's help, especially Malik's expert ribbon tying," she teased, ruffling her brother's hair. Malik puffed out his chest. "I was the best ribbon tier ever," he declared, making everyone laugh. But even as the morning passed in relative peace, Amara's mind was racing. The success of the gala had opened doors she hadn't even known existed. The question now was how to walk through them without tripping. Later that day, Rodrigo called to check in. "How are you feeling after your big night?" he asked. "Tired but excited," Amara admitted. "I never thought so many people would be interested in what I do." "People recognize quality and hard work," Rodrigo said. "You've proven yourself. Now it's time to capitalize on that momentum." Amara bit her lip. "I'm not sure where to start. There's so much to think about." "Let's meet," Rodrigo suggested. "We'll make a plan." That afternoon, they met at a small cafe near the market. Rodrigo had brought a notebook filled with ideas and suggestions. As they sat down, he began to lay out a roadmap for the next steps. "First," he said, "you need a proper brand. A name, a logo, something people will remember." Amara frowned slightly. "I don't know much about that kind of thing." "I'll help," Rodrigo said. "We'll keep it simple. Amara's Blooms already works. We just need to build on it." He flipped to another page. "Second, you need a team. You can't keep doing everything yourself. You'll need someone to help with arranging, someone to handle deliveries, and maybe even someone to manage orders." The idea of hiring people made Amara nervous. "But how can I afford that? I'm barely making enough to reinvest." "You'd be surprised how many people would be willing to work part-time for fair pay," Rodrigo said. "Start small. Maybe hire 1 or 2 people to help with specific tasks. As your business grows, so will your ability to pay them." Amara nodded, though the thought still felt overwhelming. And then, Rodrigo said with a smile, "We think bigger. You've proven you can handle events. Weddings, parties, corporate functions. These are all opportunities waiting for you. But you need to be ready." The following weeks were a whirlwind of activity. With Rodrigo's guidance, Amara began transforming her small flower-selling operation into a legitimate business. She worked with a local artist to design a logo, a simple yet elegant depiction of a blooming flower with her name beneath it. She printed business cards and flyers, which she handed out at every opportunity. Rodrigo also helped her secure a small storage space near the market, where she could store flowers and supplies. It wasn't much, just a cramped room with shelves and a worktable, but to Amara, it felt like a step toward something extraordinary. As her business grew, so did her confidence. She hired 2 local teenagers to help with arranging and deliveries, both of whom were eager to learn and earn some extra money for their families. Amara took pride in teaching them the skills Rodrigo had taught her, passing on the lessons she had learned through trial and error. Her brothers also pitched in, running errands and helping with smaller tasks. Malik, in particular, loved being part of the business, often boasting to his friends about his sister's success. One day, as Amara was setting up her stand in a new location, she noticed a familiar figure walking toward her. It was Grace, the woman who had hired her for the gala. "Amara," Grace called, waving. "I've been looking for you." Amara smiled, wiping her hands on her apron. "It's good to see you, Grace. How can I help you?" "I just got engaged," Grace said, beaming. "And I want you to do the flowers for my wedding." Amara's jaw dropped. "Your wedding?" she repeated, stunned. "Yes," Grace said. "You did such an amazing job at the gala, and I know you'll make my wedding beautiful. Can you handle it?" Amara hesitated for only a moment before nodding. "Yes, absolutely." Planning the wedding was the most challenging project Amara had ever taken on. Grace wanted an elaborate setup, with floral arches, centerpieces, and bouquets for the bridal party. It was a massive undertaking, but Amara was determined to rise to the occasion. She spent hours sourcing the perfect flowers, consulting with Grace on color schemes and designs, and coordinating with her team. Rodrigo stepped in to help with logistics, ensuring that everything was delivered on time and in perfect condition. On the day of the wedding, as Amara stood back to admire her work, she felt a surge of pride. The venue was transformed into a floral wonderland, every detail carefully crafted. Guests marveled at the arrangements, and Grace hugged Amara tightly, tears in her eyes. "This is more beautiful than I ever imagined," Grace said. "Thank you, Amara." The wedding marked a turning point for Amara's business. Word spread quickly, and she began receiving inquiries from people across the city. Her small operation grew into a thriving business with more clients, more employees, and even a website Rodrigo helped her set up. But even as her success grew, Amara never forgot where she started. She continued to sell flowers on the street, not because she had to, but because it reminded her of the journey that had brought her here. She also made it a point to give back, donating flowers to hospitals and community events, and mentoring young girls in her neighborhood who dreamed of a better future. One evening, as Amara sat with her family at their now much improved home, her mother reached out to hold her hand. "You've built something incredible, Amara," Leela said, her voice filled with pride. "And you've given us all hope." Amara smiled, her heart full. "I couldn't have done it without all of you." "And Rodrigo." Her mother nodded. "But it was your strength that made it possible." As the family laughed and shared stories, Amara realized that her journey was far from over. There were still challenges to face and goals to achieve, but she knew one thing for certain: with determination, resilience, and the support of those who believed in her, she could face anything. Her blooms weren't just flowers anymore. They were symbols of hope, growth, and the power of never giving up. The legacy of a flower. Months turned into years, and the story of Amara's blooms became a legend in her city. Amara's flower business was no longer just a street-side operation, or even a small event supplier. It had evolved into a flourishing enterprise, touching countless lives along the way. The journey had been far from easy, but every struggle had paved the way for a future brighter than she had ever imagined. The neighborhood hero. In the heart of her bustling neighborhood, Amara's transformation inspired others. Young girls who once watched her sell flowers on the street now saw her as a beacon of hope. She started a community program called Petals of Promise, where she mentored local youth, teaching them about resilience, entrepreneurship, and the art of flower arranging. One of her mentees, Amina, was a quiet but curious 14-year-old who reminded Amara of herself at that age. Amina's family had been struggling since her father lost his job, and she had started skipping school to work odd jobs. When Amina hesitantly approached Amara during one of her community workshops, it was like looking into a mirror of the past. "I want to help my family, but I don't know where to start," Amina admitted, her voice trembling. Amara knelt beside her, placing a gentle hand on her shoulder. "You start by believing in yourself," she said, "and then you work hard, step by step. Let me help you." Under Amara's guidance, Amina began helping with deliveries and simple arrangements. Slowly, the shy girl blossomed, gaining confidence and pride in her work. Amara watched her grow with a sense of deep fulfillment, knowing she was paying forward the kindness Rodrigo had shown her. Expanding horizons. Rodrigo, who had remained a mentor and partner throughout Amara's journey, often remarked on her ability to stay grounded even as her success grew. One day, during a meeting in her newly opened boutique, a small but elegant shop located in a busy commercial district, he leaned back in his chair and grinned. "You've come a long way from that street corner," he said. Amara laughed, arranging a display of lilies on the counter. "And I couldn't have done it without you." Rodrigo shook his head. "You give me too much credit. All I did was help you see the potential you already had." The boutique had become a hub for customers seeking unique floral arrangements. Amara had also launched an online store, allowing her to ship custom bouquets to clients across the country. Orders poured in daily, and her team had grown to include a dozen employees, all of whom she treated like family. But Amara wasn't content to stop there. She began exploring ways to source her flowers sustainably, partnering with local farmers, and implementing eco-friendly practices. She even started offering workshops in her shop, teaching customers how to create their own arrangements. The workshops became incredibly popular, bringing people from all walks of life together in the shared joy of working with flowers. A chance encounter. One afternoon, as Amara was closing up the shop, a man in an expensive suit walked in. At first, she didn't recognize him. His hair was slightly grayer, and his face showed signs of weariness. But when their eyes met, her breath caught. "Rodrigo?" she asked, her voice a mixture of surprise and concern. He nodded, offering a faint smile. "It's been a while." Amara gestured for him to sit, her worry deepening as she noticed the tension in his posture. "What's going on? You look tired." Rodrigo sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. "Business has been rough lately. Some bad investments, and a few deals didn't go as planned. It's nothing I can't recover from, but it's been a humbling experience." Amara frowned. "Why didn't you tell me?" Rodrigo chuckled softly. "You've been busy building an empire. I didn't want to burden you." Amara reached across the table, placing her hand over his. "You were there for me when I needed it most. Let me return the favor." Rodrigo looked at her, his expression softening. "I don't need money, Amara. I just needed to talk to someone who understands." "You're not just someone to me, Rodrigo," Amara said firmly. "You're family, and family helps each other." The conversation lingered with both of them, deepening their bond. Rodrigo left the shop that day with a lighter heart, and Amara realized that even the strongest people needed someone to lean on. A national recognition. A few months later, Amara was sitting in her shop when she received an unexpected phone call. It was from the editor of a prominent lifestyle magazine. They wanted to feature her in an article about women entrepreneurs who had overcome adversity to build successful businesses. The interview was both nerve-wracking and exhilarating. Amara shared her story, her struggles, her mother's illness, and the pivotal moment when Rodrigo had stepped into her life. The article, titled "Blooms of Hope: How One Woman Turned a Basket of Flowers into a Business Empire," went viral, bringing national attention to her brand. The exposure led to even more opportunities. Amara was invited to speak at conferences, mentor other entrepreneurs, and collaborate with large corporations on special events. Despite the fame, she remained grounded, always returning to her roots and her mission to uplift others. A promise fulfilled. One evening, as Amara sat beside her mother's bed, she reflected on how far they had come. Lila's health had stabilized thanks to proper treatment and the financial stability Amara's business had provided. Their home, once a small rundown shack, was now a comfortable house filled with warmth and laughter. "You kept your promise," Lila said, her voice soft but filled with pride. "You built something beautiful." Amara smiled, tears welling in her eyes. "I did it for you, Mama. For all of us." Her mother reached out, holding her hand tightly. "But you didn't just build a business, Amara. You built a legacy." The Festival of Flowers. To celebrate her journey and give back to the community that had supported her, Amara organized the first ever Festival of Flowers, a free event showcasing local vendors, artisans, and performers. The festival drew crowds from across the city, transforming the streets into a vibrant tapestry of colors, music, and joy. As Amara stood on the main stage, addressing the crowd, she felt a deep sense of fulfillment. "This festival isn't just about flowers," she said, her voice strong and clear. "It's about resilience, community, and the belief that no matter where you start, you can grow into something extraordinary." The crowd erupted in applause, and Amara looked out over the sea of faces, her family, her team, her neighbors, and even Rodrigo, standing proudly in the front row. In that moment, she realized that her story was no longer just hers. It belonged to everyone who had believed in her, supported her, and shared in her journey. A blooming legacy. Years later, when people spoke of Amara, they didn't just talk about her success. They talked about her kindness, her resilience, and the way she had lifted others as she climbed. Her flowers were more than just beautiful arrangements. They were symbols of hope, a reminder that even in the harshest conditions, something extraordinary could bloom. The roots that ground us. Years after Amara's blooms became a household name in her city, Amara still began her days the same way she always had, by rising before dawn. The world outside was quiet, and the air held a cool stillness that she cherished. These early moments were hers alone, a time to reflect, plan, and remember where it all began. Her routine now included a walk through the expansive greenhouse she had built behind her boutique. The space was a lush sanctuary, filled with flowers of every variety: roses, lilies, daisies, and exotic blooms she once could only dream of working with. She walked the aisle slowly, her fingers grazing the petals as she inhaled the sweet earthy aroma. This greenhouse wasn't just a testament to her success. It was a reminder of the journey, the struggles, and the people who had believed in her along the way. The return to the streets. One crisp morning, Amara decided to visit the corner where she had once sold flowers. It had been years since she had last stood there, calling out to passersby, her heart heavy with desperation, but her spirit unyielding. The corner looked different now. New shops had opened, and the street was busier than ever. Yet, the sight stirred something deep within her. She stood quietly, watching the flow of people. It was then she noticed a young boy, no older than 12, standing a few feet away. He held a basket of trinkets and cheap toys, his small frame dwarfed by the crowd around him. His face was set in a look of determination that Amara recognized all too well. Amara approached him gently. "Hello," she said, her voice soft. The boy looked up, startled. "You want to buy something?" he asked, holding up a small spinning top. "Only 10 rand." Amara smiled. "What's your name?" "Joseph," he replied, his tone wary. "Joseph," she repeated warmly. "Why are you out here so early?" Joseph hesitated, then shrugged. "My mom's sick. My little sister needs school supplies. I need to help." Amara felt a lump rise in her throat. She knelt so they were eye level. "I understand," she said. "I used to stand on this corner, selling flowers to help my family." The boy's eyes widened. "You? But you don't look like you'd have to do that." Amara chuckled. "I didn't always have what I do now, but standing right here, just like you, taught me how strong I could be." She reached into her bag and pulled out a business card. "Come to this address tomorrow," she said. I think I can help. Joseph hesitated, looking at the card, then back at her. Why would you help me? Because someone helped me once, Amara said simply. And because you remind me of myself. A new mission. Joseph's arrival at her boutique the next day marked the beginning of a new chapter for Amara's Blooms. Amara created a program specifically for children like Joseph, those who were struggling to support their families while trying to stay afloat themselves. The program, called Roots to Rise, offered mentorship, part-time jobs, and financial support for education. Through Roots to Rise, Amara partnered with local schools, charities, and businesses to identify children in need. She hired them to work in her shop after school, teaching them about responsibility, teamwork, and entrepreneurship. For many, it was their first opportunity to earn money in a safe, supportive environment. Joseph quickly became a star participant in the program. His sharp mind and quick hands made him a natural at arranging flowers, and his cheerful demeanor won over customers. Amara watched him thrive with a mix of pride and gratitude, knowing that her own hardships had paved the way for this work. Challenges of growth. As Amara's Blooms continued to grow, so did the challenges. Managing a thriving business, a community program, and her expanding team required more time and energy than Amara sometimes felt she had. There were days when she felt stretched thin, her responsibilities piling up like the petals of a wilting rose. Rodrigo, ever the steady presence in her life, remained her sounding board. One evening, as they sat in her office reviewing finances, Amara leaned back in her chair with a sigh. "Do you ever feel like you're chasing too much at once?" she asked. Rodrigo looked up from the spreadsheet, his expression thoughtful. "All the time," he admitted, "but I've learned that growth comes with discomfort. The question is whether the discomfort is worth the outcome." Amara nodded, his words settling over her like a warm blanket. "I just don't want to lose sight of what matters most." "And what's that?" Rodrigo asked. "The people," Amara said without hesitation. "The people who believed in me, who need me to keep believing in them." Rodrigo smiled. "Then you're on the right track." The national stage. The success of Amara's Blooms and the impact of Roots to Rise eventually caught the attention of national organizations. Amara was invited to speak at conferences, featured in documentaries, and even honored with an award for her contributions to her community. One of the most significant moments came when she was invited to deliver a keynote speech at a prestigious entrepreneurship summit. Standing before a packed auditorium, she shared her journey, from the girl selling flowers on a street corner to the founder of a thriving business that empowered others. "My story isn't just about flowers," she said, her voice strong and steady. "It's about resilience, community, and the belief that no matter how small your beginnings, you can grow into something extraordinary. And when you do, it's your responsibility to help others grow with you." The audience erupted into applause, and Amara felt a surge of pride, not just for herself, but for everyone who had been part of her journey. A future in bloom. Back in her city, Amara continued to build her legacy. She opened a second boutique and expanded her greenhouse to include a community garden where locals could grow their own flowers and vegetables. She also started offering scholarships through Roots to Rise, ensuring that the children in her program could pursue their dreams beyond her shop. Joseph, now a teenager, became one of her most trusted employees. He often teased her about how she had rescued him that day on the street, but his gratitude was evident in everything he did. "One day, I'm going to have my own business," he told her one afternoon as they worked together. "Just like you." Amara smiled, her heart swelling with pride. "And when you do, I'll be your first customer." The full circle. One evening, as Amara sat in her garden watching the sun dip below the horizon, her mother joined her. Leela, though older and still frail, had regained much of her strength over the years. "You've built something beautiful, Amara," Leela said, her voice soft. "Not just for yourself, but for so many others." Amara nodded, her eyes misting. "I just wanted to make you proud, Mama." Leela took her hand. "You've done more than that, my child. You've given people hope, and that's the greatest gift anyone can give. As the stars began to twinkle in the darkening sky, Amara felt a profound sense of peace. Her journey was far from over, but she knew she had laid the foundation for something enduring, something that would continue to grow and bloom long after she was gone. In her heart, she knew that every flower she had ever sold, every child she had ever mentored, and every life she had ever touched was part of a legacy that would never fade.